Photography has always been more than just a profession to me. It's an obsession. The way light interacts with nature, the textures of landscapes, the untold stories captured in a single frame. It's all a part of what drives me. The world through a lens is different, somehow more real, and more mysterious all at once. That's why, when I heard about the mountainous region shrouded in fog and whispered about in hushed tones, I knew I had to go. The journey took longer than expected. The mountain roads were narrow, winding, and seemingly endless. The air grew colder as I climbed higher, the mist thickening like a blanket being pulled over the landscape. Villages became sparse, and the few locals I encountered seemed wary, offering vague warnings about the area. I stopped at a small tavern one evening, not far from the bridge I had come to photograph. The place smelled of damp wood and smoke, and the few patrons scattered around the room spoke in murmured tones. The bartender, a grizzled man in his late 50s, poured me a drink and struck up a conversation. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, eyeing my camera bag slung over the chair. "No," I replied, taking a sip. "Just passing through. I'm here to photograph some of the old landmarks, like that bridge a few miles from here. Do you know it?" The bartender paused, his expression darkening. "The stone bridge?" I nodded. "That's the one." He let out a low sigh, shaking his head. "You'd do well to stay away from that place. It's not for you." "Why? What's wrong with it?" I asked, curious now. "There's nothing wrong with it, technically," he said, leaning in slightly. "It's just not a place people go anymore. The bridge has a reputation. They say it's haunted, cursed even. People have seen things there, things that follow them home." I couldn't help but feel a chill creep up my spine at his words, but I brushed it off. Local superstitions, I told myself. Every old place has its ghost stories. I thanked him for the drink and left, eager to see the bridge for myself. The next morning, I set out early. The mist hung low over the trees, wrapping the world in a cold, gray blanket. The road became rougher as I neared the bridge, barely more than a dirt trail cutting through the dense forest. When I finally arrived, the sight of the ancient stone structure took my breath away. The bridge stretched over a deep gorge, its massive stones weathered by time but still standing strong. Moss and vines clung to its surface, and the sound of the river far below echoed softly through the fog. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries, as if the place held memories too old to understand. I wasted no time setting up my camera, eager to capture the eerie beauty of the scene. The mist added a dreamlike quality to the shots, the bridge fading into the gray as it stretched into the distance. I moved around, adjusting my angles, taking dozens of photos from different perspectives. There was something haunting about the place, something that tugged at the edges of my mind. But I focused on my work. Satisfied with my shots, I packed up my gear and made my way back to the small guest house where I was staying. The rest of the day passed in a blur of editing and sorting through the pictures I'd taken earlier. It wasn't until late that night, as I reviewed the photos again, that I noticed something strange. In one of the images, a wide shot of the bridge disappearing into the mist, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just an artifact of the fog, a trick of the light, but the more I stared, the clearer it became. A shadowy figure, standing at the far end of the bridge, barely visible through the mist, their form indistinct but unmistakably human. I hadn't seen anyone on the bridge that day. I was sure of it. I'd been alone. A cold unease settled over me, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a person walking in the distance, someone I hadn't noticed. The mist could play tricks on the eyes. I told myself to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stared at the photo long into the night, my mind racing with possibilities. But sleep eventually claimed me, my dreams filled with fog and shadows. I woke early the next morning, the unease from the previous night still lingering like a bad taste in my mouth. The image of the figure on the bridge haunted me, its blurry shape etched into my mind. But as the light of day streamed through the windows of the guest house, I pushed the creeping dread aside. I had a job to do, and I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. The morning fog was still thick, but not as oppressive as the day before. I decided to head back to the bridge. Something about the place felt unfinished, like there was more to capture, more to understand. The mist and isolation made for the perfect atmospheric shots, the kind of images that would stand out in my portfolio. When I arrived, the bridge looked the same as it had the day before, an ancient sentinel draped in mist. The air was still, the only sound the distant rush of the river below. I set up my camera once again, deciding to focus on shots that highlighted the bridge's stonework and the natural landscape around it. This time, I wanted a better angle of the river. I leaned over the edge of the bridge, careful to secure my footing, and aimed my lens downward. The river far below shimmered in the mist, cutting through jagged rocks like a silver thread. The gorge was deep, the fall dizzying, but the sight was breathtaking. I snapped a few shots, adjusting the focus, when something caught my attention. Through the lens, I noticed a disturbance in the water, ripples that seemed out of place in the otherwise calm river. I zoomed in, trying to get a clearer view, and that's when I saw them. Hands. Dozens of pale, ghostly hands reaching up from beneath the surface of the water, their fingers clawing toward the sky, toward me. I froze, my heart racing. It was impossible. There was no way I could see something like that from this distance. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. I blinked, pulling the camera away from my eye, and looked down again with my naked eyes. The river was calm, as it had been moments before. No hands, no ripples, nothing unusual. I let out a shaky breath, forcing myself to relax. Maybe it was just a reflection. But as I brought the camera back up to my face, the hands were still there, writhing just below the surface. They moved slowly, their fingers pale and thin like the hands of the dead. I dropped the camera, stepping back in shock. The strap caught on my neck, preventing it from falling into the river, but I stumbled, nearly losing my balance. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I didn't take any more pictures after that. I couldn't. My hands were trembling too much. I quickly packed up my gear, casting one last glance at the bridge. The mist seemed thicker now, almost suffocating, and the air had grown colder, as if the place itself was trying to push me away. The hands I'd seen, I couldn't explain them, but deep down I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong with this place. I left the bridge behind me, heading back to the guest house with a gnawing sense of unease that refused to fade. As I drove, the familiar silence of the mountain roads began to feel more oppressive, the shadows cast by the trees stretching longer than they should have. My thoughts kept drifting back to those hands in the river, to the figure I had seen in the photo the night before. By the time I got back to my room, I was mentally exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I needed to know. I needed to see what I had captured. My hands shook as I connected the camera to my laptop, importing the day's shots. The images flickered across the screen one by one. Misty landscapes, close-ups of the stonework, the river. In the first few shots of the bridge, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I scrolled through the images, I saw more of them. Some kind of figures. Faint at first, barely noticeable, standing at the edges of the bridge or just beyond the mist. Their forms were ghostly, blurred, like smudges on the lens. In the next photo, they were clearer. People, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, their faces turned toward the camera, though their features were indistinct, blurred as if by time itself. My heart raced as I clicked through the photos, each one showing more figures than the last. They stood on the bridge, in the trees beyond, and by the time I reached the last few shots, they were closer, too close. In one photo, a figure stood at the far end of the bridge, watching. In the next, it was halfway across, moving toward me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. The figures were getting closer with each click of the shutter. It was as if they knew I was watching them, and they were coming for me. The final shot made my blood run cold. In it, one of the figures was standing right behind where I had been, close enough to touch. But I had been alone. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing. What was I seeing? Spirits? Something else? I didn't know. I couldn't explain it, but every part of me wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, an error in the camera. Anything but what my gut told me was true. That night I barely slept. The images replayed in my mind, those blurred faces, those ghostly forms creeping closer and closer with each shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, even now, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I woke the next morning with a lingering sense of unease. My sleep had been restless, filled with fragmented dreams of fog-drenched bridges and shadowy figures that moved just beyond the reach of light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the place, and with me. The morning light was pale and cold, filtering through the thin curtains of my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my camera on the table, my mind running in circles. What had I captured out there? Ghosts? Spirits? My rational mind fought against the thought, but the images were too clear, too unsettling to ignore. I couldn't just leave it at that. I needed answers. After a quick breakfast at the guest house, I decided to head into the village. The village was small, nestled in the mountains like a forgotten relic from another time. Most of the buildings were old, their stone walls and sloping roofs worn by centuries of wind and weather. The locals I'd seen on my first day had been polite but distant, offering brief nods of acknowledgement before returning to their work. Today, though, I had to talk to them. Maybe someone would know more about the bridge and the figures I had seen. I stopped by the small grocery store first, its interior dim and cramped, the shelves stocked with essentials and little else. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun. She glanced up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Morning," I greeted her, trying to keep my voice casual, though my mind was racing. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." The woman eyed me with suspicion, but she nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I'm a photographer," I explained, gesturing toward the camera slung around my neck. "I was up at the old stone bridge yesterday, taking some pictures. I saw, well, something strange in the photos when I looked at them later." Her expression tightened, her fingers gripping the counter a little harder. "What kind of strange?" I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it without sounding completely insane. There were figures in the pictures, people, but they weren't there when I was taking the shots. They were blurry, like ghosts or something. I thought it might be an error with my camera, but I'm not sure. The woman's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she was going to tell me to leave. But then she sighed, a long, weary sound, and shook her head. "You saw them, didn't you?" she said softly, almost to herself. I blinked, caught off guard. "You've heard of this before?" She didn't answer right away, instead glancing around the empty store as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "People around here don't talk about it, but everyone knows. The bridge, it's not a place for the living. Some say it's cursed, that the spirits of the dead linger there, waiting for something or someone. They're drawn to those who venture too close." "Drawn to them?" I repeated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The woman nodded, her eyes fixed on mine. "Those who see them, the figures, they don't usually come back the same. Some go mad, others disappear entirely. The bridge has claimed many souls over the years. It's a place of lost things." My mouth went dry. "Why hasn't anyone warned people about this?" She shrugged, her gaze dark. "It's just an old bridge to most, and we don't like to scare people away. Tourists bring money, you see, but there are those who know better, the ones who've lived here long enough." Her words left a knot of dread in my chest, but I needed more. I thanked her, paid for a bottle of water I didn't need, and left the store. Next, I decided to head back to the tavern where I'd first heard about the bridge. The bartender, with his gruff manner and knowing eyes, had seemed reluctant to talk about the place when I'd first mentioned it. Maybe now he'd give me more details. The tavern was just as quiet as it had been before. A few patrons sat at the bar, nursing their drinks, the low murmur of conversation mixing with the creak of old wood. The bartender stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a rag, his face as unreadable as ever. I approached him, setting my camera bag on the bar. He glanced at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're back," he said gruffly. "Figured you might have left by now." "I went to the bridge," I replied, watching his reaction carefully. "I saw something in the photos I took, something I can't explain." The bartender stopped wiping the glass, setting it down with a heavy clink. His expression didn't change, but there was a hardness to his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You should have stayed away from that place," he muttered, his voice low. "I told you." "I didn't see anyone up there," I continued, ignoring the knot in my stomach. "But when I looked at the photos later, there were figures, people, dressed in old clothes, and they got closer with every shot I took." The bartender sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Yeah, that sounds about right." I leaned forward. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" "I've heard the stories," he admitted, his tone guarded. "I've seen things myself, though I never stayed long enough to let them get too close. The bridge, it's a gateway, or at least that's what the old folks used to say. A place where the living and the dead meet, but not in the way you'd want." "A gateway to where?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "To wherever they are," he said simply. "The ones who never made it across." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The lost souls. He nodded, his eyes dark and serious. "The dead don't belong here, but they're stuck. The bridge traps them, holds them there, just on the edge of this world, and they're always looking for someone to take their place." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a lead blanket. The figures I'd seen in the photographs weren't just ghosts. They were trapped, desperate, waiting for someone to free them. Or worse, replace them. "So what happens now?" I asked quietly, my heart racing. "What do I do?" The bartender looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "If I were you, I'd leave. Get as far away from this place as you can. Don't go back to that bridge. Once they've noticed you, it's hard to get rid of them." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could just leave. Not without understanding more. But his warning echoed in my mind, the weight of it pressing down on me. I left the tavern with my mind buzzing, the bartender's words replaying over and over in my head. A gateway, a place where the living and the dead meet. It all sounded impossible, but the things I had seen, the ghostly figures in my photographs, the hands in the river, were more than just tricks of the light. I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't fully comprehend. As I made my way back to the guest house, the sky was beginning to dim, the early evening light casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The mist was creeping back in from the mountains, swirling in slow, lazy waves through the trees, making everything feel distant, untouchable. The town, which already felt half forgotten, now seemed almost entirely swallowed by the creeping fog. When I reached my room, I sat on the bed and stared at the camera resting on the table. I hadn't dared to look at the photos again since this morning, and I wasn't sure if I could bring myself to. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the bartender had said, about the bridge, about the souls trapped there, and how they were always looking for someone to take their place. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the room seemed to grow colder. The air felt different, heavier, like the space around me was watching, waiting. I stood up, trying to shake the feeling, and made my way to the small bathroom. Splashing cold water on my face, I leaned over the sink, breathing heavily. I had come here to capture landscapes, not ghost stories. What was happening to me? I looked up at the mirror and my heart stopped. My reflection was there, as it should be, but something else was too. A shadow, darker than the dim light of the room could account for. It stretched unnaturally long, much further than it should, creeping up the wall behind me. The shape wasn't quite right. Too tall, too thin, as if someone else was standing behind me, lurking just out of sight. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. No one was there. But the shadow, it was still in the mirror, standing behind my reflection, unmoving. Its edges seemed to ripple, almost like smoke. And as I watched, it began to shift, creeping closer to me, closer to my reflection, as if it were trying to merge with me. I backed away from the sink, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked down at my feet, but my shadow on the floor was normal. It was only in the mirror that this thing existed. I forced myself to look back at the mirror, hoping, praying that it was just my imagination. But no. The shadow was still there, growing darker, more defined. It wasn't just a vague shape anymore. It had taken on the form of a person whose outline was blurry, distorted, but unmistakably human. I stumbled back into the bedroom, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of this place, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the door as if something was about to walk through it. But the room was silent, too silent. Then I noticed it again, my own shadow, the one cast by the dim light of the bedside lamp. It was too long. It stretched across the floor toward the door, unnaturally sharp at the edges, as though the light wasn't diffusing it properly. And as I watched, it moved. Not with me, but independently. The shadow began to creep along the floor, inching toward the door as if it had a life of its own. My pulse quickened, the terror clawing at the back of my mind. This wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't my shadow at all. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. The shadow remained on the floor, but now it was moving faster, sliding across the room, crawling up the wall opposite me. I backed away. It wasn't just moving, it was pointing toward the window, toward the direction of the bridge. The message was clear. It was calling me back. I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming at me to get out. But as I reached for the handle, I felt the room grow colder. The shadow on the wall moved again, and this time it wasn't just pointing, it was taking form. A figure, dark, indistinct, but undeniably human in shape, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. The figure's shadow slid down the wall and across the floor, inching closer to me. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a presence, a force. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs wouldn't respond. I felt frozen in place, trapped by the overwhelming sensation that something was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck, waiting for me to look. The shadow stretched out its arm, reaching toward me, its fingers long and impossibly thin. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against the camera still sitting on the table. Without thinking, I grabbed it, holding it up like some kind of shield. And then, suddenly, the shadow recoiled. It didn't vanish, but it stopped, shrinking back slightly, as if the camera had repelled it somehow. I didn't know what I was doing, but in my panicked state, I fumbled with the settings, snapping a picture of the room. The flash filled the space, blinding me for a split second, but when my vision cleared, the shadow was gone. I stood there, trembling, the camera still in my hands, staring at the empty wall where the figure had been. The room was still cold, still heavy with something unseen, but the immediate threat had vanished. My shadow on the floor seemed normal again, dull, lifeless, not like the dark thing that had been stalking me moments before. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this presence was, it wasn't done with me. The guest house had never felt more suffocating. I couldn't stay another minute in that room. The presence I'd felt, the shadow that wasn't my own, there was no mistaking it. The bridge had marked me, and whatever haunted it had followed me back. But I wasn't going to wait. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my things hastily, throwing my camera and gear into the backseat of my car. The night was thick with mist, swallowing the narrow streets of the village whole. The headlights barely pierced through the fog as I sped down the winding roads that led out of town. The unease was still crawling beneath my skin, my pulse racing faster than the car itself. The village, with its sleepy atmosphere and forgotten corners, blurred into the rearview mirror. I felt the weight of the bridge lifting as I drove, but not fully gone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as though expecting to see the shadow following me, creeping along the road. The mist twisted into vague shapes, like figures standing just out of reach. But I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Suddenly, a woman appeared out of the fog directly in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car skidded to a halt, my body jolting forward against the seatbelt. My heart was in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The woman stood there, in the glare of the headlights. She was wearing a pale dress, her hair hanging limp and wet around her shoulders. She was staring at me, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes wide and empty. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. It wasn't just the shock of nearly hitting her. It was something deeper, something far worse. The way she stood there, completely still, her eyes fixed on me, no breath rising from her chest. The air around her was thick with the same oppressive feeling I'd felt at the bridge. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. One blink, and the road was empty again. The woman was gone, swallowed by the fog. I sat there trembling, my pulse hammering in my ears. It took me several minutes to regain my composure, to convince myself that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. My foot hovered over the accelerator, but I hesitated, my eyes scanning the fog for any other signs of movement. Nothing. I took a deep breath, willing myself to move. Slowly, shakily, I pressed the gas pedal and drove forward, leaving the village behind, leaving the bridge behind. By the time I reached my home, it was well past midnight. The streets of my town felt like another world entirely. Calm, normal, far removed from the haunted, mist-shrouded village I had fled from. I parked the car outside my house and sat there for a long time, staring at my front door, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I was safe now. That's what I kept telling myself. I was home. The bridge, the spirits, the shadows, they were all behind me. But the images, the memories refused to fade. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of strange anticipation. The fear from the night before hadn't fully dissipated, but there was something else now, something almost like excitement. I was going to show the photos to someone, finally tell my story. The haunting had been real. I had proof. I made a quick breakfast, my hands still slightly shaky from the events of the night, and went to my computer to transfer the photos. As I sat down at my desk, I couldn't help but feel a strange thrill. The media, the world, they'd all see what I had seen. The photos would show the figures, the haunting. Finally, I would have answers, and maybe, just maybe, validation. I plugged in my camera and started scrolling through the images I'd taken at the bridge. The mist, the eerie stonework, the timeless beauty of the ancient structure, they were all there, just as I remembered them. I clicked to the next set of photos, the ones where I'd first noticed the figures, but the figures weren't there. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The shot of the bridge was clear, but there was no one standing at the far end. No ghostly shapes lurking in the mist. It was just empty. I clicked through the next few images, my heart sinking with each one. Every photo was the same. The bridge, the landscape, the fog, but no figures, no shadows, no hands in the river. It was as if everything I had seen, everything I had experienced had been erased. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The proof I'd been counting on, the evidence of what I had witnessed was gone. The figures, the spirits, the haunting presence that had followed me from the bridge, it wasn't there. The photos showed nothing unusual, just an ordinary old bridge, lost in the fog. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. The bridge had shown itself to me, had revealed its secrets, but now there was no trace of it in my photos. No one would believe me. No one could. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. Had I imagined it? Had my mind, under the stress of the isolation, played tricks on me? No, I had seen those figures. I had felt the presence, the cold dread. I had nearly hit the woman on the road. She had been real. But now I had nothing to show for it, nothing to prove that any of it had happened. The room felt too small, too confining. I could hear my own breath coming faster, the walls closing in around me. The bridge had let me leave, but it hadn't let me go. It had erased the proof, wiped the slate clean, leaving me alone with the memory. The truth was, no one else had ever seen the bridge the way I had. The locals had spoken of hauntings, of strange happenings, but no one believed it was real. And now I understood why. The bridge wasn't just haunted, it was hidden. Hidden from everyone except those it chose to reveal itself to. And once it had chosen you, there was no turning back. I stared at the blank screen, the photos of the empty bridge taunting me. I couldn't prove what had happened. No one would believe me. But I knew. Deep down I knew. The bridge was real. And it was waiting.